Good afternoon. I feel like I'm on a runway and a plane is heading towards me with very bright lights. So I'm going to do that just so I can say it's great to see you here, and then I'll do that and I won't be able to see you anymore. But thank you for coming in on this beautiful day to have what I know will be a very meaningful conversation. And in order that we don't miss any of it, if you have not yet turned off your cell phone, if you would take a minute and do that now. I thank you for that. I hope you have had a chance to walk through the galleries in what right now looks like a transformed museum, and truly is, in terms of the power of the work that's on view. And the show that has inspired this two-part conversation is called Sea of Ice and is on the top floor. So if you didn't make it that far up, there is much to see on every level, and I mean that in every way. So welcome on behalf of the museum. My name is Patsy Hicks. I think I know many of you, and I am the long-time Director of Education here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, which is my great pleasure. Thank you. So this is the second in a two-part series that is an exploration of Romanticism, the Sublime, and its later iterations and aftermath inspired by the exhibition Sea of Ice, which, as I said, is on view in the galleries upstairs. Reacting against the 18th century's championing of science and reason, early 19th century Romantic writers and artists sought to capture the intensity and worth of individual experience, often with grand depictions of awe-inspiring nature. Today, we encounter a similar predicament in our age of climate change, politicized spaces, human-generated boundaries, and technological development. How do we represent nature and our precarious relationship to it? As Forrest Gander writes, where is the human place in geological time? We are so fortunate to have Forrest with us this afternoon in conversation with artist Tony de los Reyes, who returns after getting us started last week with poet Brendan Constantine. Forrest Gander's book, Be With, was awarded the 2019 Pulitzer Prize. Concerned with the way we are revised and translated in encounters with the foreign, his book, Core Samples from the World, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. His book, Mojave Ghost, and we have some copies outside if you are hoping to have something signed today, is central to today's discussion and has been called an excavation of interior geography, of history, of memory. In it, he writes, along the deserts and my own fault lines, I found myself crossing permeable dimensions of time and space, correlating my emotions and the stricken landscape with other divisions, the fractures and folds that underlie not only my country, but any self and its relationship with others. Tony de los Reyes' work, resonating from his exploration of Melville's Moby Dick, is part of the museum's collection and was featured in an exhibition at this museum, Chasing Moby Dick, curated by Julie Joyce in 2010, and it was referred to in last week's discussion. His most recent work, which we'll talk about today, stems from his site-specific responses to regions along the US-Mexico border. Combining the language of documentation and abstraction, he reframes our sense of the border's relationship to deep time. Geography, fault lines, disconnection, borders, grief, felt landscapes, and time are all part of this afternoon's shared perambulation of thought. So please join me in welcoming back to this stage Forrest Gander and Tony de los Reyes.
Is this on? Yes? Wow. Thank you, Patsy. That was, wow, amazing introduction. I could say speak for both of us. You nailed it. We are definitely brothers from another mother.
You can see we look like a couple here.
We're adorable. Oh, And thank you, Forrest, for being part of this sort of reflection on the sublime that happens in the Sea of Ice exhibition, which is really quite extraordinary. Has everyone seen that show upstairs? No? Okay. Oh, yes, good. It's a very important exhibition that reminds us of why we need to stay in touch with the sensibilities of the sublime, even in the artificial world that painting and sculpture and poetry embodies. These are true goals for artists to move towards a relationship with nature that isn't just, I don't know, it's that to be part of this world of the sublime is to be truly engaged with nature, even in the experience of painting, and that's something we'll talk about later on.
Yeah, this part of the sublime is the experience of humility, of awe, and there's a beautiful thing Lao Tzu says, those who are not in constant awe, surely some great tragedy will befall them. But it's not such a quality in our lives so much these days, when we feel in control of so much of our material and when we trust our computers to control our material, correcting our sentences, correcting our grammar, moving things into the most conventional patterns. But I think art and poetry can remind us of awe, and that's an important way of expanding the experience of being human.
So this is a sort of two-part presentation. The first is on what we call the bordered self, and we're going to talk a little bit about what does it mean to inhabit a space, not just a body, but to live in a space that isn't bordered, and how these borders change our sense of self, both physically and as individuals in our interiority. This is something I was very interested in early on in my work, which is these Google Earth satellite images of the U.S.-Mexico border. And I believe this is a part of Arizona, I think. And what is so intriguing about this image is these two types of patterns that are indicative of how we both experience and think the world. And one is the delineation of this to that, of a left to right, of an up to down, and this other more chaotic patterning that nature lives with and creates of a kind of beautiful meandering that takes its time to move towards the place it needs to be. Whereas the borderline is not that. The borderline is a place that is indicative of a demand. It's a declarative moment, right? It's a moment of language shifts, cultural shifts, and yet the landscape itself doesn't abide by any of those notions. So we'll be discussing this first part, what this means, and Forrest will be reading some of his poems and relating to that as well. So this is what it looks like on the ground. This is Jacumba, California. This is about 90 miles east of Santa Monica. This border wall that you see right now is relatively new. They've been in motion since 2014. And this is Jacumba, and you can see that the border line stops, and then it picks up again at the top of the mountain. What's interesting now is if you go there now, this photograph is a few years old, that line is now complete, and it continues to go all the way across. The borderline is as exact and surveyed and measured and calculated as it is in the Google Earth image, but at the same time, it does not feel like that Google Earth image. It feels much more like a scar or an intrusion, something adamant and slightly perverse.
I love that description you used just before this about the imperative of because that landscape on its own is like a natural language. Chomsky says all natural languages are recursive, that you can fold other things into them. They're folded. And whereas that line has no recursivity in it. I thought I'd read I spent a lot of time in Mexico and on the border and interviewing border agents, and we'll read a little poem called A Border History. Paisanos, they call roadrunners, brothers of the land. A dozen Mexican corpses turn maroon under the desert sun. In nearby cottonwoods, zone-tailed hawks squeal. Visible from the air, the crackalour of an abandoned runway overlies toxic waste and unexploded munitions. The runway is bordered by purple and yellow bloom stalks of lechuguilla. To the north, volcanic chimneys upthrust from barren flats. A gleam in a basalt outcrop, fist-size feldspar crystals. The old raiding trails from Comancheria converge in a path packed by fresh hoof prints. The alarming kidir, kidir of a Cassine's kingbird on the barbed fence. 150 miles of desert, surveilled by a white aerostat shaped like a whale. Between those peaks, that's Panther Laccolith, where two vaqueros in years past were staked out naked and left screaming on a live anthill. At the peak of a barrel cactus, the female katydid waves her foreleg tympanum at the stridulating males. The fine-grained intrusion that veined the eastern mountains also silled Paint Gap Hill, where a Spaniard's horse once quivered, pinned to the ground by an Apache lance. Hovering over the field, a flock of crested flycatchers. The border patrol dog, lifts its leg at the tire of the sky wagon. Coach whip fences parallel the dirtway. The Chihuahua Trail follows Alameda Creek. They call this horse crippler cactus. Vietnam-era seismic probes are buried across these private lands. Lava rock rims the roadsides. Give it a break, mockingbird. El Despoblado, nothing visible but giant yucca and bunch grass. And what ventures out into the afternoon heat? Only pharaoh ants, only the insulated darkling beetle. On either side of the pavement, magnetic sensors record movement and direction. Evening cicadas eclipse high-pitched tree crickets. They drove 1,000 head of cattle below the trachite hoodoos. It nibbles a prickly pear. What? The cottontail at dusk. Human contraband at dusk. Famous for their dwarf fauna, these fossil beds. Less so for their depositions of recent carnage, their catches of light. What was the legacy mission? And now, can you hear the carcass of the unspoken speaking?
Yeah, that's amazing. It's beautiful.
No, if you clap after all the poems, you have to clap after all the images, so we can wait till the end.
One of the things that it was really very thankful for Patsy bringing us together is that there's, I'm not here to talk about my work in political terms. I'm here to talk about my work in terms of incongruity, right? And that these are spaces that hold immense value and maybe make sense from the outside, but make less sense from the inside. And that when we experience them, the volatility of all of these experiences, all of these types of histories, really becomes very, very clear. I don't know if this is going to work. So I was worried about this. We have a little bit of an internet issue down here, but I have a film of me walking along the border wall and just seeing this sort of incongruity between this idea of these steel bollards that are about 14 feet tall and a landscape that just continues on either side. That's quite stunning. I don't think this is going to work, but anyway. So this, in talking about this, some of the research I came across was Henri Lefebvre, who is this French philosopher who talked about space and the space that I grew up like everyone else thinking of space as something you measure and with numbers and using rulers and all these types of simple ways to sort of think, well, the distance between you and me is exact, or it can be exact. And Lefebvre was one of the people, the first sort of a sociologist in many ways, who really realized that space is actually a sort of a concept that's divided into different types of modes, which are the instinctive, the intellectual, and the intuitive. And that as we move towards these overlaps in this Venn diagram, that this social space is all of these combined spaces of how we perceive ourselves. That it's not, this architecture is not this moment, but it shares the same idea of space. And so we manufacture this space constantly, not just through the programming, but also your bodies being here when they could be in some other space. And the conversations that you have outside of this space will also be about this space, because of this space occupies this time. And Lefebvre was adamant about making sure that we understand that space is something that's produced and not just existing in its own right.
It also, this notion of lived space connects with a philosopher I love, named Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who talks about in his last book, The Visible and the Invisible, the flesh of the world, and the notion that Descartes' sense that I think, therefore I am, that you can think in some place that's like not in a space, is completely wrong. That our thinking is always an engagement with what's around us, and this was other cultures have had a profound sense of this for a long time. 2,000 years ago, there was a body of 2,000 years ago. That's right, 2,000 years ago. A body of literature in southern India called Sangam that lasted for about 300 years. And in Sangam literature, the poets felt that it was not only unethical, but it was impossible to write about subjectivity, to write about the self without its connection to the world around you, which is always influencing the self, that the rhythms of your perception are connected to the place around you, that lived space involves the body and what's outside of the body interacting with the body. And even inside the body, that space isn't just our own, that in your stomach right now, there are parasites helping you digest your meal, that in all of us, our DNA has incorporated DNA from other organisms, that we're all mongrels. There is that whole racist notion of purity is a horrific corruption of what actually is.
In addition to this, one of the other things I was fascinated by was this notion, well, if that's true that space is produced, is color a kind of space, and how is the production of the color space relative to the spaces between other colors? And so this is something Josef Albers was very well known for. He taught this. He came up with the interaction of color while teaching at Yale in the 1950s, I believe, 60s and 50s. And he came from Black Mountain College and all of these amazing ways in which we reinterpreted the world. But especially for me, this grid and the center image shares the same color, but because it's on a different background, it looks completely different. And this really affected my thinking about how to engage with the border, because as all of us have experienced at some point or another, when you traverse a border, you feel different or you think different. You don't reconcile that moment as being natural, right? It's that you cross a border. It could be the dumbest border of Welcome to Santa Monica, and I'm like, oh, I'm in Santa Monica now, and it's not. It's not. Is there a different vibe? I don't know. But it's certainly Lincoln Boulevard goes right down the middle, and that was LA just a second ago. So I remember being a kid and thinking about crossing borders and thinking that, why is everything different but everything looks exactly the same?
And how does color becomes very important to some of the recent work that you've been making? How does that relate?
Yeah, I'll talk about that when we look at some paintings, but for now, the thing about color to me is that it is completely experiential and rather confusing. I have in my studio, I'm a big fan of yellow, and there are yellows that seem so unlikely to be yellow that they want to move over to the reds. Like they don't want to be a member of the yellow club, they want to be on the pink club. And those are the yellows I like the most. The screaming yellows have their place, but they seem to be the kind of person you want to have lead the dinner party earlier rather than later. So for me, color becomes a way of talking about this in an anti-intellectual way, but in an experiential way, and that hopefully when I return to the border work, you'll see how this works. Before we get to that, I wanted to at least talk about this one slide. This is a place I visited strictly by accident, and was amazed to think of that notion of what it felt like to have one leg in the northern hemisphere and one foot in the southern hemisphere. And you know, theoretically, you're moving at the slowest part of the world through its revolutions and right, because you're in the whitest part.
So that's the fastest.
Is it the fastest of the poles? No, it's one or the other.
I think the fastest is going to be, since the surface area is greater.
Yeah. You're right. I'm sorry. Yes. But I just remember feeling that all of these conflicted emotions, and also being in a tourist trap, which was part of a moment of national pride, right? So you're in this sort of conflicted production of space zone that is very meaningful, but also quite confusing.
I just noticed
Yeah.
how much that image is going to look like an image you're going to show of the border marker.
Yes.
Later.
Yes.
Yeah.
Markers are important. So this was so you have to understand, I was working with these Google Earth images, and I was taking very, very literally the same type of documents that you saw on that early slide, and just focusing on the landscape. But what is interesting to me is, through use of color and of kind of a strict sensibility about moving this towards art rather than documentation, is that it moved into a more fluid space of perception. And so the color blue, the color green, using these consistently gray lines, it's really pulling right out of Albert's book, is what does that gray line look like on a different color in a different location, satellite location. And of course, that this could be folds of cloth, it could be cellular, images of the skin on a cellular level. But the superimposition of this line, which is sometimes because of the Rio Grande, but all of the straight lines were drawn with a pencil in 1848. That was the thing that really made me think that this involved art at some point. When you use a pencil to make a straight line, whether it's dividing the United States and Mexico, it's also a drawing, and it's always a drawing.
It's interesting too. There are a number of cultures in which well, for instance, in classical Chinese, blue and green are the same color. So it often gets translated sometimes as blue. The plum is blue or the plum is green. There are other cultures that mix blue and green also. And there are some island cultures where the number of colors are very few, but include degrees of wetness or dryness as part of color. So color itself our relationship with it is a constructed relationship.
And I remember there was a lot of talk a few years ago that the word blue doesn't even appear in literature until it started to be manufactured, or in the late 1700s. That blue, for some reason, everyone took blue for granted, and that was it in the Iliad? Go ahead. You want to?
No.
I think,
right
but
there.
I
I'm
understand
with you, yeah.
that the sea is written as
Wine dark.
wine dark. So there's no blue in the ocean; it's wine dark. And
Yeah.
so I don't know. You can Google that, and it's fascinating.
It's the same. The Mahabharata, the great Indian epic. There's only in this entire huge corpus of literature. There's only 3 colors that are mentioned. Also, evidently, biologists will tell you that blue is very rare in nature, and that some insects don't see it. So, when we see a blue jay, you all know this one. Blue jays aren't blue. That what we're seeing is light refracting off their feathers in a way that appears to us as blue, but has no blue pigment in it.
Yeah. So this idea of so what happened was I said, if I'm going to make work about the border, I just can't rely on these Google Earth satellites. I need to go down there, and so starting around 2018, all my work was about from my own photographs. And so when I knew there was going to be quite a scene at the Calexico border crossing, and in 2018, I wanted to see the big Trump floating blimp. I don't know if you remember I have lots of photographs of that. It was this really wild moment where you had pro-Trump supporters, anti-Trump supporters, and it was like this festival of politics. And of course, it was all happening right there in front of the fence, and it was theater. Right? I mean, at that time, it was all very, very new. And so just to be in this space watching theater evolve, the theater that you see on television, this is your CNN reporter. And I was just struck by the degree to which the border became a kind of prop and not an actuality, but a kind of like a tease to describe geopolitics. And then when I was in Tijuana at the Benito Juarez Sports Complex, I remember there was a lot of discussion about migrant caravans coming up to the border and in 2018. And so again, this proximity, right? This is basically the same, we're in a different location of the border, but the border becomes a site of attraction, of conflict the minute you draw the line, right? The minute in fact, the more that you go over the line and make it deeper and bigger and taller, the more it becomes a catalyst for rhetoric, which is outside of the land itself. Yeah. Which is in stark contrast to what it was 100 years ago, right? I mean, my great-grandmother crossed the border in 1916 into Texas, and that's why I'm here, right? So I am a part of a migration pattern. And these images from that time, I mean, imagine you crossing a dirt road and then someone saying, "Oh, do you want to take a picture of you crossing the boundary line?" And these are people. These are people on a little trip.
So your grandmother came over. Great grandmother during the you're not that old. during the Mexican Civil War, Revolutionary War.
Yeah, she actually, her husband was killed. He was the mayor of a town that is no longer gone because a dam was built, and he was assassinated by the revolutionaries.
Yeah.
And so she decided to go to the United States to, not an unusual story today, right? Is to get away from the violence of the time.
And at that time, there were during and just after the Mexican Civil War, there were about a million people that left Mexico, were forced out of Mexico, as Mexico became more nationalistic, like the U.S. is becoming now, or has been for a while. That sense of nationalism drew that borderline more strongly, and Lebanese that had migrated into Mexico the 50 years before were forced across the border, and other groups of people that had been living in Mexico were forced across as nationalism drew that line deeper.
Yeah, so this was around the time when my grandmother crossed. What's great, these are all my postcards. You can buy them on eBay. They're like $20 each. And the great thing about these postcards is often they have writing on the back. And on the back of this one, it says, it's to someone in Oklahoma, right? So the soldier is from Oklahoma, and it says something to the effect of, "Dear Mom, I do not like it here. The whole place is full of sand." And that's all it says. So I think what happened is the soldiers could buy these postcards and then send them, they would be developed there, and then they'd be sent home. Yeah, so this is the border line. The border was made around 1916, this marker. And before these, they were just piles of stones that surveyors used to mark the distance and the latitude. This is taken just east of Tijuana, and the metal fence you see there was built in the 1960s and 70s, and that is the border. Those are metal landing mats left over from the Vietnam War. So you have this kind of interesting idea of a space that is becoming more fortified. This wall is gone now. Now it's the 14-foot tall bollard wall that we saw before. But what's interesting, just from a speculative level, is when you're at a space like this, you realize on the southern border, the United States is shrinking a little bit. It's moving inward however many feet. And it's sort of this, almost like a scab, like a protective layer, so that it becomes more fortified, and the wall gets bigger and the space gets smaller. So it kind of acts in fear, like an animal acts in fear, right? Like when an animal, or we get goosebumps or hairs on our neck stand up because we react, right? So the border itself is in a form of reaction constantly. So we're going to move more into this idea of the nowness of what we're talking about in terms of the landscape and the infinite time, the deep time that both Forrest and I are definitely engaged in. And I decided to move in the last few years away from working from these abstract images, these satellite images, to working with just the landscape, and to get on the ground and to shoot everything on my stomach, and to always shoot in the direction of the border, to reshape the dynamics between the border and the land, for the land as the imperative and the border as the distant thing. And as any of us do when we go into nature and we really start to scrutinize the landscape, we see that it seems to defy probability. This one rock, which is no bigger than this, is made out of sand and water and has this wild split that must have happened through some eroded way. But I'm always taken by the little specks of plants that sort of sprout out like errant hairs on the skin of the earth. And so these images, I'll come back to that in a second, but these images became the starting point of my work, of the more recent work, to think about a way in which the timeless or seemingly timeless of the earth was interacting with the border space itself. So we're going to just talk briefly. These are people that have influenced us greatly. These are the geologist James Hutton, who was the first person in Western world to realize that the Earth was a lot older than 6,000 years, because up until about 200 years ago, everyone thought the Earth was 6,000 years old, that it started around 2000 BCE. And reading this fantastic book about basin and range by John McPhee, there's a similarity. These quotes show us that there's this, if you understand how old the Earth is, it's both liberating and terrifying. That we're part of this giant, monumental relationship to time, not just in the universe, but on the Earth. And also at the same time, we're humbled, as we talked about in terms of the sublime, but we're also invigorated because it makes us part of the universal, of the timeless.
Should I read a poem? This is called Rift Zone. A shell jacket and approach shoes are things that rock climbers often wear. Rift Zone. And so find myself in a shell jacket and approach shoes, strolling past boulders on the xeric canyon path, limbed with mustard flowers, as though it were my garden, as though I'd never drawn those distinctions that separate me out, as though I hadn't long back expelled myself from all that wasn't myself. But where is the human place in geologic time? Is there some quality in me that links I am to the remainder, to whatever is left over, left out? What in the world have I left out of me? Adjusting a headband beneath my hat, I lift the binoculars to my lined face. Displaced by lateral slip, the mountain's slopes have gone wonky. A human life, what is that anyway? Even here, at the disturbance zone, I find myself pierced by birdsong, standing among trunks and vines, risen from the ground like the births and messages they are. A riven land, this place belongs solely to itself. From the wall of a crevasse, tree roots jut out into air. The fault is the earth's junction box, where its wires are bared. The conflict churns underground, howling out in the faintest of decibels. Of course, there were signs, but no one of us witnessed the ballet of trees as the tectonic strain below them rose, and they inclined suddenly toward each other from where they'd stood rooted to the parting lips of a widening rift. The earth humphed and rolled, and the trees bowed forward and held their new pose, which strangely resembles a gesture of devotion. But back at the start, I was occupied with myself, as though I were never to be apart, as if I weren't both in and of it. Of what? So I hiked the long fault for some new point of view, asking, muddled with anxiety, what comes next now that I can't claw my way any further from what doesn't resemble me? The earth keeps stretching, knuckling, stretching out from under itself, hungry for a new shape, a new address. It has tossed itself loose from its sheets and risen, leaving behind a note I suppose I could read if I tried. The fissures run through everything, even through my remaining years, which I can count probably on my fingers. I fan them out and stare at their ruptured, upturned faces, the faces of my remaining years. I try reshuffling them, but no, they grimace one through the other. They release a sulfur smell. Their solidity dissolves like long clouds of filth, entering a river. My time is here and not. Feet dangling, I'm perched at the edge of what? Listening to the crackle, the extinctions of small breaths around me, while crevices bloom from the crevices and dust lifts and catches in dry catches of wind. Heat and silence, still the ground insists its openings will be filled. Why not apply? Apply myself over and over. This argument goes beyond me. I, who have never been homeless, groundless. Am I just going to stand gobsmacked at the mirror while my years run out? What is left of experience that hasn't been measured? Is there an app for that? As I bend, I feel the weight of the specimen stones I carry in my jacket pocket slide forward as I continue my solo descent along the canyon's seam, as I sip and hold a quick breath, as I slip from sight into a chimney of rock.
The phrase, the ground insists, this is something I very much appreciate when I'm there and I'm taking these photographs. There is a kind of, I'm sort of humbled in the same way a young child is humbled by a parent when I'm out in these spaces, that it seems to have a knowledge much greater than myself, and at the same time doesn't lecture me. It just insists on being the power. And when I come across, these are concretions, these are natural stones that are made from sort of loose, sort of silty sand and rain and wind. And these happen over, I've long time.
Years.
Yeah. And they're just there. It's like, I feel like I'm a bull in a china shop where I'm just, everything becomes, every little thing, every little sprout, every little motion of wind on the stalks becomes a kind of a story that it's trying to tell me. And because we don't speak the same language, I have to grasp at it through art, and it's the only thing I can do.
I love that you're taking it from the perspective of the land, that you're down there with that rock.
Yes, I'm definitely there with that rock. The thing for me is I'm not a photographer. I don't think of myself as a photographer. So how do I make this into something else? How do I make it into art? Right? These are beautiful and interesting, but perhaps in the same way that somebody gives you, maybe somebody gave you this rock and you held it in your hand, you would marvel at it and you would think this is amazing, but you wouldn't necessarily linger on it in the same way you do with art or poetry. So this a photograph like this then becomes a painting like this. And getting back to the color and this intuitive relationship to color, to me, what I'm trying to do is extract that experience of seeing that rock through the camera lens miles back in my studio and trying to, how do I reimagine that moment I had? And to pull it far enough away from its source that it becomes its own type of rock. Does that make sense? That the rock that I'm painting now is not so much my rock, but another rock, sort of a relationship to that previous rock. So I have thousands of these photographs. Why is it that one moves me and another doesn't? It doesn't matter, but it's kind of the same dilemma you have when you're walking through any type of landscape. Why does that one thing reach out to you, and why do you want to look at it? Why do you want to pick it up? You don't know, and that's fine. So the question is, now that you have it, what do you do with it? Do you put it back down and you leave it as a memory that it just gets absorbed by everything else? Or are you able, as an artist, to sort of take that moment and maybe parlay it into something else? So these more recent paintings are less cerebral, I would say, and much more about these kind of occluded moments of memories, but they're not about memories, they're about these spaces and trying to regenerate the youthfulness of those moments that the landscape is offering to me. Because even the rock images, even however old this thing is, which has to be. Oh, by the way, this stone, this was part of glacial debris. So that this is a stone that was taken off the mountain 10,000 years ago when it was part of an ice sheet in the Sonoran Desert. So 10,000 years ago, which is nothing. When we see these big border images, this is covered in ice. And this is a little bit of grit within that sheet. But this doesn't seem old to me. That's the crazy thing. It seems new. It seems like it's just wanting to reach out to me. And I'm sure you have that same experience with all of the things you see.
I think when you walk through the desert, the past is constantly, that rock was probably buried under a bunch of sediment and it has been rising. It rises to the surface, and the bones of migrants who have died in the desert trying to cross the border are sinking into the desert. And the past is rising up and the present is sinking down, and that's part of geological time.
So this is a way to try and describe how these paintings come to be. So if this is a source photograph on the left, what you're going to see is how this painting starts. There's that screaming yellow, which I don't like, but guess what? It's going to go away. It starts with this really wild use of abstraction and layering that starts with a flat color field, in this case is the yellow, which is then layered with washes of oil paint. And then I go in, and where the negative spaces are on the rock or someplace, I tend to repaint them in a very, very sort of hesitant way, because what's going to happen is I'm going to start to layer the silkscreen images from the photograph back on top of that. And then on the right, what happens is I go back in with the paint. So it's a push and pull procedure of literal relationship between the paint and that photographic image, which to me is a kind of, again, a kind of mimicking of the geological pressures.
Are you using a brush?
I'm using a brush and silk screen, so I'm pulling, like, for a shirt or something, I'm pulling a photographic image of that screen onto the painting in oil paint. So it's always oil. It's always the same material that artists have used forever. But I think the relationship between its materiality is different, right? So I'm definitely using the photographic processes, but also the way in which paint moves on its own. And then if you go up to the, I think that's why Patsy and I get along, is that she saw the connection between this work and the work that's upstairs. Is that I am trying to reincorporate that sense of awe, perhaps for the first time I saw this one stone, and the way it sort of poked across the border wall in the background, and that poked itself. The border wall was in front of another mountain range, but everything becomes sort of hopefully luminous and indistinct. I do go back in and try and I don't know if you see on this right there. Well, up there, there's a little leaf or a couple leaves. Those moments matter to me in this otherwise sea of abstraction that's happening. They're not huge paintings. I'm working on some larger things now, but that is the goal of everything I'm working on right now.
So, and what I love about this and your process is that you take something that's an object, and what is an object except something that we're removed from, right? And you invest yourself in it so that we're no longer removed from an object here. We're engaged with something inside of you, your imagination, your intuition. It becomes a combination of world and subjectivity and imagination, and it has what it picks up in that process is this the space for us to engage with it and to not quite know what it is, to see connections between it and so-called natural world, and natural nature, Patsy talking about that in the beginning, of course, isn't ever separated from us. We are nature, Suzanne says, I am nature. And here you are.
I think we're going to move to your the Vimeo piece.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, right, and then
And then
pick up.
I'll end up with my
Okay.
last thing. This is probably the most abstracted talk I've ever led, but I think hopefully it all is sort of making sense. We're going to sort of end with two, hopefully we can get these working, films. One is, I think you have to get out of that.
Yeah.
And what I'm going to show you is a project I'm working on now that is pretty drastically different for me, but has all of the same aspects of what I'm doing visually, but I'm trying to do it with sound and sculpture.
Let's see if this works. It's not showing.
Summer roadrunners patrol the
Okay, thanks.
Has anyone been to the borderlands outside of the point of entry? Where have you been? Oh, El Paso Juarez, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, those are two, those are amazing cities. I spent some time in Juarez in around 2018, and there used to be a trolley where you could get on and you could just go across and back and forth. Jacumba has a sister town called Jacumbe, and that was, people would go, exchange, eggs and whatever, produce, and that all ended around in the 1980s. But the porosity of the border is kind of what makes California, California, and we forget that to our just not good. I live in Los Angeles. What can I say? I love LA.
And porosity is a nice word to bring up in relationship to your work too, because of all the layers that go into constructing it, and then the sort of membranes that we're looking through, and looking at that work with the color fields.
So, did you go to both cities? Yeah. And El Paso is completely dry. Yeah. And also the cultural influences between New Mexico and El Paso are pretty stark. New Mexico is extremely proud of not being El Paso. Huh. Yeah. There was a great, I forget the name of the artist, but there was an artist who, before 1848, there was the border between the United States and Mexico went all the way up to like Oregon, I think. And so, no, Colorado. And so he actually took those markers and he had them in the back of a truck. And he just went to all of that. He took photographs of the border markers where it used to be in Colorado. And so it was just a really great artist project. There are a lot of really good artists who were working with the border. I'm tending now to do it in a more ecological way.
Yeah, yeah, I've got it up here. Just for some reason, it is. I don't know what. Okay, switching. Yeah, it's up on the screen. I'm not understanding what's happening here.
Well, you have that poem too, right?
I don't have it here, but I'll read a short poem to finish this. It's on
microphone, we can hardly hear you. Yes. Thank you.
So instead, I'll end with this poem, which is one of the poems from the book Mojave Ghost, where my wife, my partner, Ashwini Bhatt, and I are walking along the San Andreas Fault. But here, you said, at the time of our intrusion, you said this zone here is not one of the Earth's sentences, but an overdub of stutters. Here, where we're walking on this slumbering crack, a complex, you said, of tensions right here. And you bent and touched your finger to the warm, ant-fenestrated dirt, while I surveyed the hairpin turn in the arroyo beside us. And then you stood and brought it, your finger, to my lips. You said, here, and you watched me as the taste, part you, part earth, brought a change to my face. Thank you.
Can you get back to the slide deck? Is that possible?
Yes.
All right. So I'll very quickly, and thank you for your patience. I'm starting to think about the oral part of this work, and this idea that how can I be more explicit about what I'm experiencing? And I was trying to have some audio with this, but it doesn't work. So what you know, an artist is only as good as their questions. And my question was, these paintings aren't doing enough. What can I do more for this landscape? And the idea was, I was fascinated by doing something sculptural and sonic, which I've never done before. And so I created these, I am in the process of creating these steel microphones that are about 8 feet tall, and placing them along the border for about 4 to 6 hours, and just recording the sounds of the border. What I wanted to do was make an object that was a kind of opposite of the border. If the border is a linear fence that's vertical, what about the shape of something conical? Something that starts from, you know, this perfect circle diameter and moves into a point, like an ear, and that actually has a microphone in it. So these were photographs I took in last December, and this is how I imagine me making these things. There's going to be about 4 or 5 of them, and my idea is that when I bring them back to the studio or gallery exhibition setting, that they will play like a quartet 4 hours of different parts of the border, very simply. And this is not, sometimes there's animal sounds, but what I was most interested in was capturing the sound of wind against steel as it was trying to capture other sounds, which to me is indicative of what the border is doing itself. Like, how do we capture a space? How do we allow ourselves to be confronted with its actuality and not our imposition on it? That's what my work, and I think Forrest's works, has been all about.
And yeah, I mean, our history as a species is to use the earth for our transactional use, and this is the opposite. This is listening, which is humility again. It's what is the other saying?
I think that's it. Thank you. I'm sure we went over time, but are there any questions about either of our work or approaches?
Yeah.
I hope I can say this. You touched on so many things that thank you. You've touched on so many things that have been in the front of my mind lately. And I love that you started it with the notion of awe. And I've been struggling in these challenging times to think about how to face things squarely and mean to make a difference where I can, but not lose sight of awe and gratitude also. And I think That's what I witnessed here. And I don't know exactly how I'm going to take this with me because I don't see one-to-one translation for daily life, but I will. And I'm really grateful that you met the border squarely and with awe. Is that fair to say?
No, I actually, this newer work came out of that dilemma, right? The sheer amount of what, sort of witnessing the political trauma and fallout that's happened, which I did have some of that. I didn't show any of that body of work, but that was definitely part of it. And I just really had to, in order to maintain a sense of, I don't know, just not fall apart. I'm greatly comforted by the land itself, and thinking of the time in which that border wall will continue to dissolve, just like everything else. In fact, one of my favorite objects I have in my studio is that if you go down to La Playas in Tijuana, there's a big steel wall like that goes all the way out into the ocean, which is like wild, right? Like you can swim around it. Obviously, you can't because Border Patrol are there. But what's fascinating is on these big steel plates that are at the top, very top of the border wall, because of the salinity in the air, they slough off in sheets, so that there are these piles of sheets of steel that are sort of look like coral reefs that are all the de-skinning of the border wall. And to me, I take enormous comfort in knowing that time itself is just going to do what it wants to do. And if you can take that as being the truth we need to hear or a truth that's part of what we want to hear, it doesn't matter. It is going to happen, right?
Other questions or comments? Is that finger? So one of the most ferocious poets I know. Yeah.
We can hear you. That's okay.
So, and I have a question for Laura Mullen, who lives in Santa Barbara and is one of the most important poets in the country for me. I wanted to ask you sort of how you respond to her situation, where you feel an intense anger and ferocity. How do you keep that? How do you keep your sense of awe, yourself together?
Goodness, I didn't expect to be answering a question.
It's your talk now.
Anger is an energy. It's a really important energy. It's something you can tap and you can use. That keeps me in there. And then art is a big part of my ability to stay in awe. And my question was, do you know the work of the composer and sound artist Richard Lerman?
No.
Oh, he lived here in Santa Barbara. He just died on the 20th. And he has gone to Death Valley with tiny little microphones to record the sounds of ants and shrimp and wind and dust. And it's really extraordinary. So I thought I'd put him in your loop.
I've started to hang out with the sound artists, which are a completely different breed of animal. Maybe in the same way that poets are for me, right? They're really excavating. We're excavating the same site, but we're in different dimensions.
And Forrest's point about the humility of listening is so crucial. Yeah, the sound artists, the musicians, they will save us. They really will.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in and steal. I lived in Arizona and had my orthodontist was in El Centro. And so to see, was that Calexico with the blue and the yellow?
Yeah.
It reminded me of Stein. You've made me see it a totally different way, and I really appreciated that, and I just wanted to make that comment. So thank you. Gertrude Stein.
Yeah.
Well, because a rose is a rose is a rose,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It's really not. And then there it is, forcing me to see it a new way. Because if you're from that area or lived any time there, it's not really, it doesn't have a good reputation, and people take that desert for granted when there's incredible beauty there, and you've transformed it with your art and made it, as you said, not the rock, but another rock, So.
Yeah, it's funny. El Centro's, I was out near El Centro when this work started to shift. I wanted to take photographs of the border wall against a supermoon, which is the closest distance between the moon and the Earth. And I was just outside of El Centro, and the beautiful dunes in the middle of the night with these, almost like 2001: A Space Odyssey monoliths there with the moon rising over it. And it was just really captivated by the inability of my mind to wrap around where I was. But those dunes and that landscape there really, is so compatible with going insane, or being dismissed as being ugly. But it is if you just can tune into the wavelength, it's absolutely vivifying,
Thank you, Patsy, for organizing this, for setting us up together, which was a real pleasure for me. And thank you to the Santa Barbara Museum